food labeled healthy? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you may look at your grocery cart very differently. For years, public health messaging focused heavily on cholesterol as the central cause of heart attacks, leading many people to avoid foods like eggs or shrimp while filling their kitchens with products marketed as heart healthy. However, major institutions such as the NIH and Harvard Health explain that cardiovascular disease is more complex than a single blood marker. Cholesterol itself is a waxy, fat-like substance that your body actually needs to build hormones, vitamin D, and cell membranes. Problems tend to arise not simply from cholesterol existing in the bloodstream, but from how it interacts with inflammation and oxidative stress inside artery walls. Research discussed through PubMed and emphasized by organizations like the WHO shows that chronic inflammation plays a central role in the development of atherosclerosis, the process where plaque builds up in arteries. Think of your arteries as flexible pipes lined with a delicate inner surface. When that lining becomes irritated through factors like smoking, chronic stress, high blood sugar, or oxidized fats, the body responds with an immune reaction. Cholesterol particles can then become part of the repair process, but if inflammation persists, that repair process can contribute to plaque formation over time. Harvard Health has repeatedly clarified that heart disease risk depends on multiple factors, including diet quality, movement, sleep, smoking status, blood pressure, and metabolic health, not cholesterol alone. The Cleveland Clinic also explains that oxidation, a chemical reaction that occurs when certain fats are exposed to heat, light, or air, can produce compounds that may promote oxidative stress in the body. Oxidative stress is essentially an imbalance between free radicals and the body's ability to neutralize them, and it is frequently referenced in NIH literature as a contributor to chronic disease processes. This is why focusing only on lowering cholesterol numbers without addressing overall lifestyle patterns may miss the bigger picture. The CDC emphasizes that heart disease is influenced by dietary patterns, physical inactivity, obesity, diabetes, and high blood pressure. In other words, it's the long-term environment inside the body that matters most. While cholesterol levels are still an important clinical measurement and should be discussed with a healthcare professional, modern research suggests that inflammation, metabolic health, and overall dietary quality play equally significant roles. That's why many experts now encourage a whole food eating pattern rich in vegetables, fruits, legumes, and minimally processed fats, rather than simply avoiding one nutrient. This discussion is meant for general educational purposes and should not replace personalized medical advice, but understanding the broader scientific context from respected sources like the NIH, WHO, CDC, Harvard Health, Mayo Clinic, and Cleveland Clinic helps clarify why the conversation around heart health has evolved beyond cholesterol alone. When we talk about heart disease, cholesterol is often treated as the main villain, but major health organizations explain that the deeper issue frequently involves chronic inflammation within the arteries. The WHO describes cardiovascular disease as a condition influenced by multiple risk factors, including unhealthy diet, tobacco use, physical inactivity, and metabolic conditions such as diabetes and hypertension. Similarly, the Mayo Clinic explains that atherosclerosis, the buildup of plaque in artery walls, begins with damage or irritation to the inner lining of the arteries, known as the endothelium. You can think of the endothelium like a smooth protective layer inside a water pipe. When that lining becomes irritated, tiny cracks or dysfunction can develop. According to research summaries available through the NIH and PubMed, inflammatory responses are central to this process. The body treats arterial irritation almost like a wound. Immune cells move into the area, and cholesterol particles, especially low-density lipoprotein, LDL, can accumulate at the damaged site. However, it is not simply the presence of LDL cholesterol that creates plaque. Rather, it is how those particles behave in an inflammatory and oxidative environment. Harvard Health emphasizes that oxidized LDL is more strongly associated with artery damage than LDL alone. Oxidation is a chemical reaction that occurs when molecules interact with oxygen, particularly under conditions of heat, stress, or metabolic imbalance. When LDL becomes oxidized, the immune system may recognize it as harmful, triggering further inflammation. Over time, this cycle of irritation and immune response can contribute to plaque buildup. The Cleveland Clinic also notes that inflammation can make plaques unstable, which increases the risk of rupture, an event that may lead to a heart attack or stroke. This is why focusing solely on lowering total cholesterol numbers without considering inflammation may overlook an important part of the risk profile. The CDC highlights that lifestyle factors such as smoking, high blood pressure, poor diet, obesity, and lack of exercise increase cardiovascular risk because they contribute to both endothelial damage and systemic inflammation. For example, chronic high blood sugar can damage blood vessels, while smoking introduces chemicals that directly injure arterial walls. Poor sleep and chronic stress may also elevate inflammatory markers, as discussed in NIH-supported research. These factors create an internal environment where plaque formation becomes more likely. In this context, cholesterol can be seen less as a root cause and more as part of a larger biological response to injury. Importantly, major institutions like the NHS and Mayo Clinic still recognize cholesterol management as relevant, particularly for individuals at higher risk. However, they increasingly emphasize overall cardiovascular risk assessment rather than focusing on a single lab value. Heart health depends on the interaction between cholesterol levels, inflammatory processes, blood pressure, metabolic health, and daily habits. Understanding this broader framework, supported by reputable sources such as the WHO, NIH, CDC, Harvard Health, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, NHS, and peer-reviewed research indexed in PubMed, helps clarify why inflammation is now considered a central player in cardiovascular disease rather than cholesterol acting alone. Refined seed oils such as soybean, corn, sunflower, and canola oil are widely used in packaged foods and restaurants, and while the original seeds contain beneficial nutrients, the concern often discussed in scientific literature relates to how these oils are processed and handled. These oils are high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs, particularly omega-6 fatty acids. According to information available through PubMed and summarized by institutions like the Cleveland Clinic and Harvard Health, polyunsaturated fats are chemically more unstable than saturated or monounsaturated fats because they contain multiple double bonds in their structure. Those double bonds make them more vulnerable to oxidation when exposed to heat, light, and air. Oxidation is a chemical reaction that can generate free radicals, unstable molecules that may contribute to oxidative stress in the body. The NIH describes oxidative stress as an imbalance between free radicals and the body's antioxidant defenses, and this imbalance has been linked in research to chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease. When seed oils are extracted on an industrial scale, they typically undergo processes such as high heat treatment, chemical extraction, bleaching, and deodorizing to improve shelf stability and neutral flavor. While regulatory agencies consider approved processing methods safe within guidelines, researchers cited in PubMed have explored how repeated heating, such as deep frying at high temperatures, can degrade these oils further, producing oxidation byproducts. The Cleveland Clinic explains that when oils are heated beyond their smoke point, they begin to break down, and repeated heating cycles common in commercial frying can accelerate the formation of potentially harmful compounds. These compounds may increase oxidative stress when consumed frequently in large amounts. Harvard Health notes that omega-6 fatty acids are not inherently harmful and are essential in small amounts, but balance matters. Historically, human diets contained a more balanced ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fats. Modern ultra-processed diets, however, often contain disproportionately high amounts of omega-6 fats due to heavy use of refined seed oils in snack foods, baked goods, and fast food. Some researchers referenced in PubMed suggest that excessive omega-6 intake relative to omega-3 intake may promote pro-inflammatory signaling pathways in certain contexts, although this remains an area of ongoing scientific discussion. The WHO and NIH consistently emphasize that overall dietary patterns, rather than single nutrients, determine long-term health outcomes. It is also important to distinguish between moderate home cooking with fresh oil and frequent consumption of heavily fried, commercially processed foods. The CDC links high intake of ultra-processed foods with increased cardiovascular risk, partly because these foods tend to be high in refined oils, added sugars, and sodium while being low in fiber and micronutrients. From a biochemical perspective, oxidized lipids may interact with LDL particles in the bloodstream, potentially increasing the likelihood of oxidized LDL formation, which Harvard Health identifies as more strongly associated with atherosclerosis than unmodified LDL. In summary, concerns about refined seed oils are largely centered on their chemical instability under high heat, their dominance in ultra-processed diets, and their potential contribution to oxidative stress and inflammatory processes when consumed excessively. Reputable sources such as the NIH, WHO, CDC, Harvard Health, Cleveland Clinic, and peer-reviewed studies indexed in PubMed provide the scientific framework for understanding how processing methods, heating practices, and overall dietary balance influence the health effects of these commonly used oils. Ultra-processed foods have become a dominant part of modern diets, and many of them are marketed with terms like heart-healthy, low-fat, or cholesterol-free, which can create a false sense of security. However, major public health institutions such as the CDC and NIH emphasize that cardiovascular risk is strongly associated with overall dietary patterns, rather than isolated label claims. Ultra-processed foods typically contain refined grains, added sugars, sodium, preservatives, and industrially processed oils, all designed to enhance taste, texture, and shelf life. According to research available through PubMed, higher consumption of ultra-processed foods has been linked to increased rates of obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. These associations are thought to result from a combination of poor nutrient density, high caloric load, blood sugar spikes, and inflammatory responses. The WHO identifies unhealthy diet as one of the leading modifiable risk factors for cardiovascular disease worldwide. Ultra-processed foods often displace whole foods such as vegetables, fruits, legumes, nuts, and minimally processed proteins, which provide fiber, antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals. Fiber, for example, plays a significant role in heart health. Harvard Health explains that soluble fiber can help improve cholesterol balance and support stable blood sugar levels, while antioxidants help neutralize free radicals that contribute to oxidative stress. When ultra-processed foods dominate daily intake, the body may receive excess calories and inflammatory triggers, but insufficient protective nutrients. Frequency of consumption also matters. The NIH highlights that chronic exposure to poor dietary patterns can lead to low-grade systemic inflammation. Think of inflammation like a dimmer switch rather than an on-off button. Each processed snack, sugary drink, or fried meal may not cause immediate damage, but repeated daily exposure can gradually raise inflammatory markers. The Cleveland Clinic notes that inflammation contributes to endothelial dysfunction, which is an early step in atherosclerosis development. Over time, this can create an internal environment where plaque buildup becomes more likely. Another concern is blood sugar regulation. Many ultra-processed foods have a high glycemic load, meaning they cause rapid increases in blood glucose. The CDC explains that repeated blood sugar spikes can increase the risk of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, both of which significantly raise cardiovascular risk. Elevated blood sugar can damage blood vessels and promote inflammatory signaling, further compounding the effects of poor diet quality. Additionally, high sodium content in processed foods contributes to elevated blood pressure, which the WHO identifies as one of the strongest risk factors for heart disease and stroke. Importantly, no single packaged product determines heart health in isolation. The NHS and Mayo Clinic stress the importance of long-term dietary patterns built around whole, minimally processed foods. When ultra-processed foods become occasional rather than daily staples, the body is better equipped to maintain metabolic balance. Scientific evidence from reputable organizations such as the CDC, NIH, WHO, Harvard Health, Cleveland Clinic, NHS, and peer-reviewed research indexed in PubMed consistently supports the conclusion that dietary patterns rich in whole foods and lower in ultra-processed products are associated with better cardiovascular outcomes over time. Cardiovascular health is shaped not only by diet, but by a combination of daily habits that influence inflammation, blood pressure, blood sugar regulation, and vascular function. Major institutions such as Harvard Health, the NHS, the CDC, and the NIH consistently emphasize that lifestyle factors, including sleep quality, stress levels, and physical activity, interact with nutrition to determine long-term heart risk. For example, sleep plays a critical regulatory role in hormonal balance and immune function. The CDC states that adults who regularly sleep fewer than the recommended hours are at higher risk for conditions such as high blood pressure, obesity, and type 2 diabetes, all of which increase cardiovascular risk. Research discussed through the NIH explains that insufficient sleep may elevate inflammatory markers and disrupt metabolic processes, creating a physiological environment that places strain on the heart and blood vessels. Chronic psychological stress is another major contributor. When the body perceives stress, it releases hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. In short bursts, this response is protective. However, when stress becomes persistent, elevated cortisol levels can contribute to higher blood pressure, increased blood sugar, and greater inflammatory activity. The Mayo Clinic notes that long-term stress may influence behaviors and physiological responses that raise heart disease risk. Harvard Health further explains that stress can indirectly affect the heart by encouraging unhealthy coping behaviors such as overeating, smoking, or physical inactivity, which compound biological strain. Physical inactivity is equally significant. The WHO identifies insufficient physical activity as one of the leading global risk factors for mortality. Regular movement supports cardiovascular function by improving circulation, helping regulate blood pressure, and enhancing insulin sensitivity. According to the CDC, moderate physical activity strengthens the heart muscle, allowing it to pump blood more efficiently. Exercise also supports endothelial function, the health of the inner lining of blood vessels, which the NIH identifies as essential in preventing atherosclerosis. When individuals sit for prolonged periods with minimal activity, circulation slows and metabolic efficiency declines, potentially contributing to weight gain and increased cardiovascular strain. Metabolic health connects all of these elements. The Cleveland Clinic explains that conditions such as obesity, insulin resistance, and hypertension often cluster together, amplifying inflammation and vascular stress. Lifestyle habits act synergistically. For instance, poor sleep may increase cravings for ultra-processed foods, which can raise blood sugar and inflammation. Chronic stress may elevate blood pressure while reducing motivation for physical activity. Over time, these overlapping factors create cumulative strain on the cardiovascular system. Reputable organizations such as the NIH, CDC, WHO, Harvard Health, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, and NHS consistently highlight that heart disease prevention is not centered on a single nutrient or behavior. Instead, it involves creating a supportive internal environment through consistent sleep, regular physical activity, stress management, and balanced nutrition. Scientific literature indexed in PubMed reinforces that comprehensive lifestyle patterns are associated with lower cardiovascular risk compared to isolated interventions. This integrated perspective underscores why sustainable daily habits are foundational to long-term heart health. A balanced understanding of heart health recognizes that no single nutrient or food determines cardiovascular outcomes on its own. While cholesterol has long been emphasized in public discussions, leading institutions such as the WHO, NIH, Mayo Clinic, Harvard Health, CDC, NHS, and Cleveland Clinic consistently explain that heart disease develops through a complex interaction of inflammation, blood pressure, blood sugar control, genetics, lifestyle habits, and overall dietary patterns. Cholesterol remains an important biomarker that healthcare professionals monitor, particularly LDL cholesterol, because elevated levels are associated with increased cardiovascular risk. However, modern clinical guidance increasingly evaluates overall risk profiles rather than focusing on cholesterol in isolation. The Mayo Clinic explains that factors such as smoking, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and physical inactivity significantly modify risk even when cholesterol levels appear normal. Inflammation is central to this broader perspective. The NIH describes atherosclerosis as an inflammatory disease of the arteries in which immune responses, oxidative stress, and lipid accumulation interact over time. Harvard Health notes that reducing chronic inflammation through healthy lifestyle choices may help support long-term cardiovascular health. This does not mean eliminating cholesterol entirely, since the body produces cholesterol naturally and relies on it for essential biological functions. Instead, public health recommendations from the WHO and CDC emphasize sustainable dietary patterns rich in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and minimally processed fats. These foods provide fiber, antioxidants, and micronutrients that help regulate metabolic processes and counter oxidative stress. Stable cooking practices and minimizing heavily processed foods are also frequently discussed in reputable sources. The Cleveland Clinic highlights that excessive consumption of ultra-processed foods, often high in refined carbohydrates, sodium, and industrially processed fats, can contribute to metabolic dysfunction. When combined with insufficient sleep, chronic stress, and low physical activity, these patterns may elevate inflammatory markers and blood pressure. The CDC underscores that high blood pressure remains one of the strongest predictors of heart attack and stroke, reinforcing the importance of routine screening and lifestyle management. Regular medical checkups are another key component emphasized by the NHS and Mayo Clinic. Blood tests, blood pressure monitoring, and discussions about family history allow healthcare providers to assess individualized risk and recommend appropriate strategies. Importantly, this educational discussion is not a substitute for personalized medical advice. Individuals with existing conditions, strong family history, or specific concerns should consult qualified healthcare professionals for tailored guidance. Scientific literature indexed in PubMed supports the idea that long-term adherence to balanced lifestyle patterns, rather than short-term restrictive approaches, correlates with improved cardiovascular outcomes. The overarching message reflected across trusted institutions such as the WHO, NIH, CDC, Harvard Health, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, and NHS is that heart protection comes from consistent, evidence-based habits. Focusing on whole dietary patterns, regular movement, adequate sleep, stress management, and routine medical care creates a